Today we're going to talk all about drum bus compression. I think one of the hardest things is even after you learn what the basic controls are and what they do, the struggle is figuring out the interplay between the controls. You know, how the threshold and ratio affect the attack and release, and how all these controls are related to one another. So you can't just make an adjustment with one. A lot of times you have to go back and adjust the others. So what I want to do today is just practice listening and talk about how to hear the compressor and the different controls and what they're doing, and do some ear training here, because that is really what will speed you up so you can get faster at dialing in the settings that you want and not run around in circles so much. So let's dive right in and start turning some knobs and take a listen. We're going to be using Molotov here today. Now, this is a free compressor from Tokyo Dawn, and it's an awesome little compressor. It's not a VCA or a FET. It's kind of its own thing, but it has a great sound and it has a great display. And if you can learn how to hear compression on this thing, then you'll stand a great chance of grabbing any other compressor and dialing it in the way you want. Now, this little control right here is kind of unique. This is their alpha, beta, sigma control. And when you first open it up, it comes all the way on alpha, but for bus compression, you want it on beta. And this is basically like peak versus RMS detection, and it changes the way the attack behaves dramatically. But we're going to leave it there on beta, and we're going to leave the knee at 0.5 for this tutorial, which is its most natural setting. And it also defaults to the sidechain high pass at 120 hertz, which is perfect because that's in between the kick and the snare, so the compressor won't be overreacting to the kick. And this is a great way to start to just practice listening to the relationship between attack and release, threshold and ratio. So now here's an instance of Molotov that is set to a more snappy, punchy setting. And now we're going to switch it over to more of a beefy, weighty sound that's going to less accent the transients and more accent the decay and sustain on the drums. All right, so let's play around with this and start with this at its default settings on attack and release and threshold. We're going to stick with the ratio of 4:1. Now, this little lighted meter that goes around the threshold is really useful. So you can see right now we're not getting any gain reduction because the peak is coming right up to where the threshold is. Now, if you turn on your compressor and you're not seeing something like that, you're seeing something more like this. See how the lighted meter is going all the way to the end? That's because of gain staging. The signal's coming into the compressor too hot. Proper gain staging is to make sure that you're somewhere in the neighborhood of -12 to -18 dB. So that's something to keep in mind. Make sure that your compressor is not getting too hot or too weak of a signal. Now, that said, let's engage the threshold here and listen to that crack of the transient of mainly the snare, and listen to how that's affected as we start to catch the peak. So we're catching a little bit of that transient now, but we're not digging the threshold down into the rest of the waveform yet, the decay and sustain and release of it. Now let's increase the ratio to more of a limiter setting and really squash that peak and listen to the transient and how it responds. All right, now let's speed up the attack and let even less of the transient through. So this would be more like a limiter where we're just squashing the peak. Yeah, so that's kind of how a limiter would affect a peak transient. But now we'll back off on the ratio and just do heavy compression and really bury the threshold. So we will be affecting the decay and sustain, but just listen to the transient. So now the drums sound further away from us. They sound like they're further in the background. And now we're going to slow the release down and listen to the rest of the waveform, the decay and the sustain, and listen to how that increases, making the drums more beefy and weighty. See, that's totally different than a fast release like this. That's more snappy and punchy. And this is more beefy and weighty and roomy. So now let's go with a slow attack. Now we're letting all that transient through, and let's go with a really fast release. So now we're really snappy and punchy. The attack is really slow, so it's letting all of the transient through, and the release is really fast, so it's not sustaining the body or weight of the drum. Now let's slow the release down. And now we're going to back off on the ratio, so even with the threshold buried into the signal, we're not compressing it so hard. That starts to sound pretty natural right there. Let me bypass it. Now we've gotten a lot of snap and punch because we're not affecting the transient, but we're also adding some beefiness and weightiness to the body. If we speed the release up, the beefiness and weightiness will go away. Slow it back down. Now we're going to go extreme and clamp the threshold down even harder. So we're fully buried into the ADSR of the signal. And we're going to speed the attack back up and let less of that transient through. So we'll speed up the release again now and listen to the beefiness go away, but we're doing it now with the threshold clamped down really hard. So listen to the difference. So even with the fast release, with the threshold engaged that far, we are still making it more beefy and weighty. And a lot of that is coming from the makeup gain. The makeup gain is pushing the tail end of the waveform up. Bypass. So the point here is that I wanted you to hear that there's more than one way to do it. So even with a snappy and punchy attack and a fast release, you can still get the beefy and weighty tail end of the drums with the fast release if you've buried the threshold far enough. Then the question simply becomes, do you like that sound? Now, obviously, the goal of drum bus compression to begin with is to glue the drums together so they sound like one cohesive instrument, not like a snare separate from a hi-hat, separate from a ride. We kind of want to glue them together so they sound the same. And we want to enhance the punch and the groove of the song in a rhythmic way. And the interplay of all those controls gives you a whole bunch of different ways on how you do that. And a lot of that is dependent on the tempo of the song. This is why you don't really want to pay too much attention to the milliseconds, on the attack and on the release, because fast settings in a slow song would be slow settings in a fast song. Now, when you're going to set your attack, one of the good tricks to know is that it's easiest to hear the attack if you're doing it at a low monitoring volume. So if you turn your playback down till it's really quiet, it'll be easier to just hear the transient when you're trying to dial in your attack setting. And you want to do that in the context of the mix. You don't want to do it in solo. And as you go for a faster attack and let less of the transient through, make sure you're adjusting your makeup gain as well. And you can always bypass and go back and forth to make sure you're level matched. And when you're setting your attack, you want to listen to the relationship between the attack and the threshold. Because if you go a little too far with your attack and make it a little too fast, but then you back off on the threshold a hair, that might be the right attack setting. But if you have an attack setting that's a little too slow and then you turn up the threshold and engage it a little more, now you might have the right attack setting. So the attack is dependent on the threshold and vice versa. So when you're setting your attack at a low volume, you might want to do both. If you want a little more transient, slow down your attack, see how that sounds, put it back, and then back off on the threshold a little bit to let more of the attack through. Because that's two different effects. It's not going to sound the same because the threshold affects how far you're engaging the rest of the waveform. So your attack the way you want is one thing, but your attack relative to the rest of the decay and sustain is another. And a faster attack might also call for decreasing the ratio a little bit. So let's dive back in and just focus on the attack. And we're going to start with the attack as fast as it'll go. And then we're going to back off the attack, but we're going to do it at a low listening volume and listen to how much transient we want in our mix as we start to back off the attack. So that's a good way to hear the attack at a nice low listening volume, just listening to that transient and the way that it cuts through the mix. So let's say we like our attack right about there. Now listen to the threshold. If I back off on it, listen to how much more attack it lets through. And if I clamp down on it a little more, so if I clamp down on it a little too far and then back off on the attack, that might be about the same amount of transient coming through, but it's a different sound. So more threshold, slower attack. See, the kick drum is getting a lot punchier. A little more. Now that we're so far buried into the decay and sustain of the waveform, it's a completely different sound, even though the amount of transient coming through is pretty similar. So there's different ways you can do this. Let's back off on the threshold again and go for a fast attack. When we do it that way, the tail end has increased a lot. It sounds like there's more reverb on the snare. There's not. It's just relationship between the decay and sustain of the waveform to the attack is being altered. The best way to learn how to hear this is not just listen for the transient, but to also listen for the sustain and decay of the sound because they're relative to each other. Release is much harder to hear than attack, and a couple important things to know about release, especially with drum bus compression, you pretty much never want to get faster than about 20 milliseconds. If you go faster than 20 millisecond release, you stand the chance of not only compromising your low end and maybe altering the weight and beefiness of your kick drum in a way that you don't like, but you can also simply create distortion. So your release should never be as fast as it can go. That's probably never a good idea. 20 milliseconds is a safe bet for about as fast as you want to go. We want it to completely recover before the next downbeat comes in. So let me show you what that looks like. So you can see the meter is recovering to the 0 mark before the next snare hit on the average 4/4 beat here. So we can slow the release down further. And you hear how that changed the attack? It didn't actually change the attack, it changed the way we perceive the attack. Let me slow it back down. But if you go too slow with the release, you're basically just turning down the drums because the needle will never recover. But what you're looking for is to kind of time it with the tempo of the song to make sure you have full recovery to the 0 mark before the next snare hit. And then from there, you go a little faster or a little slower depending on the feel that you want. For this tempo and this beat, this would be a really slow release. It's almost at 1 second. Now, if this were a fast tempo song, this would be way too slow. Now, a really slow release will also accentuate the pumping sound. Listen to the high end and in the cymbals to see what the release is doing and how bad it's pumping. You might listen to that at a lower volume. It might be easier to hear, but if you want to hear what the release is doing to the beefiness and weightiness of the snare and especially the kick drum, you'll want to listen to that at fuller volume. I'm going to go to this drum fill here. When the kick and snare hit, there's a little bit of a ducking sound in the crash cymbal. Now listen to that with a faster release. So the faster the release, the less obvious that pumping will be. With a really slow release, that pumping in the crash cymbal will be more obvious. And again with a fast release. So when you're setting your release, you're not just affecting the tail end of the snare and the kick drum and the toms in the sense of how beefy and weighty they are. You're also affecting the high end because the compressor is responding to the transients of the snare and the toms and stuff. So that's something to think about as well. And on that topic, if you get the release and attack set the way you want, but you have too much pumping going on with the cymbals, then that might be a sign that you want to revisit the compression on the kick and the snare before they get to your drum bus. Maybe with a little limiting or clipping, or increase the compression on the kick and snare before they get to the drum bus. The more of those transient peaks that you have under control, the easier it will be to dial in your drum bus compression. And that pumping in the cymbals is a good gauge of that. Now, another good gauge of that is this free loudness meter. This is called U-lean. So if you solo out your drums and listen to your loudness range, this one right here is going to tell you the range of decibels in between your transients and the rest of the material. So if this loudness range right in here is reading like in the high 20s or 30s, you haven't done enough gain reduction on your kick and on your snare before it got to the bus. In fact, the lower this number is, the easier it's going to be to do your drum bus compression. So yeah, if you get your settings the way you want, but you have an unpleasant pumping in a crash cymbal or in a ride cymbal, that's a big indicator that you might need to control some of those transient peaks before they hit your drum bus. That'll make your drum bus compression easier. that's a good synopsis there of how to listen to attack and release. And you also got to consider the ratio at all times. Here's our snappy, punchy settings that we started with. So now if I increase the ratio from 4:1 to more like 8:1, this is going to be a bit much. Back at 4:1, it's a little more natural sounding. Let's put it in the mix. So that's nice and punchy and snappy. But if we back off on the ratio, it'll start to sound a little more gentle and natural. It's still punchy and snappy because of our settings, but it's a little less aggressive. And if we need it more aggressive, we can go increase the ratio. And something else to consider, you can automate this ratio. So say you want to back off on it for the verse, but you want to clamp down on it a little harder for a chorus. That's something you could think about. Something else I want to point out here, a common mistake with beginners with drum bus compression is having too slow of an attack time. How forward in the mix do you really need your drums to be? They sound better if they're really forward, but at what point is it distracting? We'll dial the attack forward and back a little bit and see where we want the drums to actually sit in the mix in terms of how much transient comes through. So there we're back to our default settings of attack and release, ratio of 4:1, threshold engaged till we have about 3 dB of gain reduction, makeup gain to make up for it. And that's kind of a happy medium. We still might have a little too much transient, so I'll speed up the attack a little bit. And I'm going to slow down the release a little bit so they get a little more weighty and beefy. Here we go. Engage the threshold a little more. Bypass. Back on. Yeah, that's nice. Move bypass again. So that's our original drum kit. Here it is compressed. See, it's beefier, it's weightier, it sounds more cohesive and glued together, and the transients are way more under control and they're way less distracting. That enables the fiddle and the vocal to come more into the foreground. We can always slow down the attack just a hair to let a little more of the drums through if we want it a little punchier or snappier. Little goes a long way. How's that sound? Bypass? Yeah, that's nice. Well, I hope that helps. I hope you enjoyed that. Let me know what you guys think. Hit me up in the comments section and let me know if there's anything else you want me to tackle. And I hope you join us over at the Patreon. We're doing a great mixing contest this August on Patreon. We're going to do a mix review and vote on the winner, and it's going to be a lot of fun. So if that sounds fun to you, check out the Patreon. It's only $5 a month. We do a Q&A over there every week, and there's like 3 hours of great Q&A on a whole bunch of topics that you can catch up on and enjoy the conversation. Alrighty, happy mixing. I'll see you on the next one.